The fog wrapped around his throat like cold fingers, and James Holloway's boot slipped on wet limestone 6 inches from the edge of Clingman's Ridge. 300 feet of empty air yawned below him, swallowing the screams of wind that carved through the Tennessee mountains. His daughter's medication sat heavy in his jacket pocket, the pills he couldn't afford, the choice he'd already made. One step forward and the insurance money would pay for Sarah's treatments. One step and she'd live. But then he heard it, a voice threading through the mist, female and ancient and impossibly close. "Not tonight," it whispered, and he felt pressure against his chest, solid as hands, pushing him backward onto solid ground. He landed hard on his tailbone, gasping, and through the swirling white he saw her, a woman made of moonlight and memory, her 1940s dress hanging in tatters that moved against wind that didn't exist. Her eyes held depths darker than the valley below, pools of sorrow that had calcified into something resembling purpose. "You're not meant for the ridge tonight," Eliza May Thornton said, her voice carrying harmonics of decades spent calling through fog, warning others away from the drop that had taken her life 73 years ago. James scrambled backward, his mind fracturing around impossibility, and she smiled, sad, knowing, eternally patient. "Go home to your daughter. There are other ways." She reached toward him, and he felt warmth despite the October cold, despite the fact that her fingers passed through his shoulder like smoke. "I've been waiting here since 1949, catching the ones who come to jump. You're the 47th. Her form flickered, destabilizing in the strengthening wind, and for just a moment he glimpsed what she'd become in 7 decades of solitary vigil. Not quite ghost, not quite guardian, something stranger still. Something that had learned to touch the living world through sheer force of desperate will. "How?" he managed, and her expression shattered into grief so raw it made his own despair seem small. "Because I couldn't save myself, so I save everyone else instead." If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world, you are listening to me. Eliza May Thornton had been 29 years old when the ridge took her, and she'd been 29 ever since. Time moved differently in the in-between spaces, the liminal territories where the dead who couldn't let go carved out their strange eternities. The Tennessee mountains held more ghosts than living souls, Cherokee spirits still walking their stolen lands, Confederate soldiers frozen mid-charge, women murdered by jealous husbands in isolated hollers. But Eliza was different. She'd chosen her haunting deliberately, claimed it with a purpose that kept her tethered, when she should have dissolved into whatever came after. The fog was her domain now, the thick Appalachian mists that rolled down from Clingman's Ridge every autumn, carrying her voice to those who stood too close to the edge. She'd learned to solidify just enough to push, to pull, to guide the desperate away from the drop. 47 lives saved in 73 years, 47 souls who went home instead of down. And yet she remained anchored to the ridge by the weight of her own unanswered question. If she'd saved herself, would any of this matter? The living couldn't understand what it meant to exist as pure intention, to become a function rather than a person. But watching James Holloway stumble down the trail toward the parking lot, his daughter's medication still unopened in his pocket, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Hope that maybe, just maybe, her death hadn't been entirely meaningless. The first time Eliza had fallen through the barrier between living and dead, she'd been too shocked to scream. One moment she'd stood at the ridge's edge, her husband Frank's letter crumpled in her fist, the words "I never loved you" branded across her vision. The next her foot had found only air, and gravity had done what gravity does. The fall lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough for her entire life to unspool before her. The farm in Sevierville where she'd grown up, the church social where Frank had smiled at her like she mattered, the wedding everyone said was too rushed, the slow realization that he'd married her for her father's land and nothing more. Long enough to feel the October wind whipping her dress, to see the rocks rising up fast and final. Then impact, and the specific silence that follows when a body stops being a body and becomes simply meat and broken bones. But consciousness persisted. She'd felt herself lift free, tethered to flesh by only the thinnest threads, and in that moment she'd understood with perfect clarity that she could go. There was somewhere else, somewhere warm and welcoming, pulling at her like gentle hands. Her mother waited there, and her baby brother who'd died of scarlet fever, and a light that promised everything the ridge couldn't: peace, release, an ending to all the pain Frank had carved into her heart. Yet even as that light called her home, Eliza had heard something else, a sound threading through the November evening, faint but distinct, crying. Someone else stood at the ridge, just 20 yards from where her body lay crumpled and cooling. A man she'd never met, a stranger with his own letter, his own reasons for believing the world would be better without him in it. And she'd thought, no, not again, not here. The light had still been pulling, but she'd pulled back harder, wrapping herself around the ridge like roots around stone. She'd learned to call through fog she didn't need to breathe, to solidify air into something resembling hands, to push. The man had stumbled backward, his eyes wild and searching for the source of the pressure against his chest. He'd run eventually, leaving Eliza alone with her cooling corpse and the choice she'd made. They'd found her body 3 days later. The coroner called it accident, though everyone in Sevier County whispered suicide. Frank had sold her father's land and remarried within a year, happy as he'd never been with Eliza warming his bed and his bank account. He'd died in 1987, and Eliza had felt his passing like distant thunder, another soul moving on to wherever souls were meant to go. But not her, never her. She had work. The ridge became her cathedral, her prison, her purpose. 73 years taught her things the living couldn't comprehend: how to read desperation in a person's walk, how to taste suicidal intention on the wind, how to move through fog like a fish through water. The Appalachian mists were thick with history and sorrow, perfect cover for a ghost with a mission. She'd learned to sense when someone came to the ridge with death in their hearts. It manifested as a cold spot in her awareness, a void where life should thrive. She'd drift toward it through the fog, invisible until she chose otherwise, and she'd watch. Sometimes they came alone, like James Holloway with his daughter's medication and his accountant's precision in calculating insurance payouts. Sometimes they came in pairs, murder-suicides that turned her stomach even after 7 decades of death. Twice teenagers had driven up drunk and stupid, daring each other to walk the ridge's edge. She'd saved them all, or most of them anyway. 3 had slipped through her fingers, their momentum too great, their determination too strong. She'd felt each one fall, felt their terror transform to resignation to nothing as gravity claimed them. Those failures haunted her worse than her own death ever had, but the successes sustained her. James was 47, and she'd learned all their names, memorized their faces. She'd watched from the fog as they drove away, as they returned to lives they'd been ready to abandon. She couldn't follow them beyond the ridge. Her territory had limits, invisible borders she couldn't cross. But sometimes, years later, she'd feel them thinking of her. A warmth in the fog, a whisper of gratitude carried on mountain wind. That was enough. It had to be. The alternative was accepting that she'd wasted 73 years accomplishing nothing, that her death had been as meaningless as Frank's letter had claimed her life was. So she stayed, and she watched, and she waited for the next desperate soul to find their way to her ridge. The pattern held for 7 decades. Then Rebecca Martinez drove up the mountain with a recorder and a camera, and everything Eliza thought she understood about death and purpose shattered like ice beneath spring rain. Rebecca was 23 and saw dead people, not metaphorically, not in dreams or visions, but actually saw them walking around like anybody else. Her gift or curse, she hadn't decided which, had manifested at 8 when her grandmother died and kept showing up for Sunday dinner. By 23, she'd learned to live with it, built a YouTube channel around it, turned her particular brand of crazy into something approaching a career. She specialized in helping ghosts move on, in solving the mysteries that kept them anchored to grief and unfinished business. Tennessee was full of unfinished business. She'd been working her way through East Tennessee for months, documenting hauntings at abandoned hospitals, old battlefields, houses where murders had soaked into the foundations. But Clingman's Ridge interested her for different reasons. The statistics were impossible to ignore. 47 attempted suicides in 73 years, and 47 survivors who all reported the same thing. A woman's voice in the fog, a pressure pushing them back from the edge, a glimpse of someone who couldn't possibly exist. Rebecca parked her beat-up Honda Civic in the turnout at dusk, when the barrier between worlds grew thin and cooperative. She'd brought her equipment, full-spectrum camera, digital recorder, EMF detector, but she suspected she wouldn't need it. The ghost here was strong, active, purposeful, the kind of spirit that didn't need electronic devices to make itself known. She was right. The fog rolled in fast, unnaturally fast, and Rebecca felt the temperature drop 15 degrees in as many seconds. Her breath plumed white, and the EMF detector in her jacket pocket began shrieking before she'd even turned it on. Then she heard the voice, exactly as 47 witnesses had described. Female, gentle, carrying harmonics that didn't exist in living throats. "You shouldn't be here after dark. The ridge is dangerous." Rebecca smiled and spoke to the empty air, to the fog that moved against the wind. "I know you're dangerous, Eliza. I'm not here to jump. I'm here to talk." The silence that followed felt shocked, if silence could carry emotion. Then the fog coalesced, and Eliza May Thornton stood before her, fully visible, her 1940s dress hanging in impossible tatters, her eyes holding 7 decades of solitary purpose. "You can see me," Eliza whispered, and Rebecca heard the loneliness in those 3 words, the weight of 73 years without a single person meeting her eyes and understanding what they saw. "I can," Rebecca said gently, "and I think we need to talk about why you're still here." Eliza hadn't spoken to anyone who could hear her in 73 years. Oh, the people she'd saved had heard her voice, felt her touch, but they'd never truly seen her. They'd glimpsed movement in fog, heard whispers carried on wind, felt pressure they attributed to adrenaline or divine intervention. But Rebecca Martinez looked directly at her with brown eyes that reflected firelight from sources that didn't exist, and Eliza felt the foundations of her solitary existence begin to crack. "I'm here because people need me," Eliza said, defensive, pulling her tattered dress tighter, though she couldn't feel cold anymore. "I save them." Rebecca's expression softened with a pity that made Eliza want to scream. "You're here because you're punishing yourself. For what, I don't know yet. But Eliza, you've spent 7 decades doing penance for something. Don't you think that's enough?" The question hit like a physical blow. Enough. When was anything enough when you'd failed yourself so completely that death seemed like the only reasonable option? When your own husband looked at you and saw nothing worth loving? When you'd been so weak, so pathetic, so worthless that jumping off a ridge seemed like the kindest thing you could do for everyone involved? Rebecca stepped closer, and Eliza realized with shock that the young woman wasn't afraid. Everyone else who'd seen her had run or frozen or collapsed into gibbering terror. But Rebecca moved toward her like approaching a wounded animal, hands open and empty, voice pitched low and soothing. "Tell me what happened," Rebecca said. "Not the fall. Before that, tell me about Frank." And God help her, Eliza did. The words poured out like water from a broken dam, 7 decades of silence shattering in the presence of someone who would actually listen. She told Rebecca about growing up believing she was special, that the farm and the mountains and the small church community meant something. About Frank appearing like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she'd been praying, handsome and charming, and interested in plain Eliza Thornton when he could have had any girl in 3 counties. About the whirlwind courtship, the wedding, the 6 months of marriage where she'd slowly realized he smiled more at her father's land deeds than at her. About finding the letter he'd written to another woman, the one he'd actually loved, explaining that he'd married Eliza for money and would leave as soon as the property transferred to his name. About standing at the ridge with that letter in her fist, looking down at rocks that promised an end to the humiliation, the betrayal, the crushing weight of being so fundamentally unlovable that her own husband couldn't pretend for more than 6 months. "I jumped because I believed him," Eliza finished, her voice fracturing. "I believed I was worthless, that the world would be better without me. And then I died and realized he was wrong, but by then it was too late. I'd already made the choice, already proven that I was exactly as weak as he'd said." Rebecca was crying. Tears tracked down her face, reflecting moonlight that penetrated the fog in silver streams. "Oh, Eliza." "Honey, no. Depression lies. Despair lies. And Frank was a bastard who lied too. You weren't weak. You were sick and alone and in pain. That's not weakness. That's a medical emergency nobody treated." Eliza wanted to believe her. God, she wanted to believe that her death hadn't been proof of some fundamental deficiency in her character. But 73 years of self-recrimination had carved channels in her consciousness too deep to redirect with a few kind words. "It doesn't matter what I was," Eliza said. "All that matters is what I do now. I save people. That's my purpose." "Saving other people isn't the same as saving yourself," Rebecca said quietly. "And Eliza, I don't think you can move on until you forgive yourself for being human, for hurting, for making one terrible choice in a moment of unbearable pain." The ridge shuddered beneath them. Or perhaps it was Eliza shuddering, her form destabilizing as Rebecca's words burrowed into the armor she'd built around her guilt. Forgive herself. The concept seemed impossible, absurd, like asking water to flow uphill. She'd spent 7 decades earning the right to exist through service, through saving others from the mistake she'd made. If she forgave herself, what would be left? What would keep her tethered? What would give her death meaning? Rebecca seemed to read the questions in her silence. "You're afraid that if you let go of the guilt, you'll disappear. That the only thing keeping you here is punishment. But Eliza, what if you stayed because you chose to? Not as penance, but as purpose. What if you saved people because you're good, not because you're trying to prove you deserve to exist?" The possibility hung between them like dawn breaking over the ridge, and for the first time in 73 years, Eliza May Thornton considered that maybe her death hadn't been the end of her story. Maybe it had been the beginning. Rebecca visited the ridge every evening for a week, and each night she and Eliza talked until the fog thinned with approaching dawn. The young medium brought food she couldn't share, sat on the cold stone, and listened to 7 decades of isolation pour out in torrents of ghostly confession. Eliza told her about the 47 people she'd saved, describing each one with perfect clarity, their names, their faces, the specific shapes their despair had taken. She told her about the 3 who'd slipped through her fingers, how she still heard their screams echoing through the fog on particularly quiet nights. She told her about the loneliness, the way time felt both endless and compressed when you existed outside it, how she'd watched the world change through the eyes of visitors to the ridge, watched hemlines rise and fall, watched cars replace horses, watched cell phones transform the way people documented their final moments. In return, Rebecca told her about the living world, about the 47 people Eliza had saved and what they'd become. She'd tracked them down through newspaper archives and social media, through public records and good old-fashioned investigative journalism. James Holloway, the man from that first night, had gone home and declared bankruptcy, reorganized his finances, found a charity that covered his daughter's treatments. Sarah was 15 now, healthy, thriving, with no idea how close she'd come to losing her father. The first man Eliza had ever saved, Marcus Washington, back in 1949, had lived to 93, built a family of 37 children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom existed because Eliza had pushed him back from the edge. Rebecca showed her pictures on her phone, this magical glowing rectangle that held entire lives inside it, and Eliza saw the ripples her choices had created. 47 lives saved. But the math was bigger than that. Those 47 had children, grandchildren, friends they'd influenced, communities they'd shaped. The numbers expanded exponentially. 173 direct descendants, thousands touched indirectly, entire futures that existed because Eliza May Thornton had chosen to stay anchored to grief instead of moving toward light. "You didn't save 47 people," Rebecca said on the 5th night, her voice thick with awe. "You saved generations. Do you understand what that means?" Eliza didn't. She'd spent so long focused on the immediate, the next desperate soul, the next life pulled back from the brink, that she'd never considered the larger mathematics of salvation. But looking at Rebecca's phone, at the faces of people who wouldn't exist without her intervention, she felt something shift in the architecture of her haunting. Maybe she hadn't been punishing herself. Maybe she'd been doing something far more important. On the seventh night, Rebecca brought Pastor Ezekiel Crawford. He was 67, black, with kind eyes and a collar that marked him as Episcopal clergy. He'd served churches throughout East Tennessee for 40 years, and he specialized in what he called transitional ministry, helping ghosts move on when they were ready. Eliza had felt him coming before his car reached the parking lot. His presence registered as warmth in the fog, as light that pushed back against the shadows she'd cultivated. When he stepped onto the ridge and met her eyes, she saw understanding there and acceptance, and a total lack of fear. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to speaking to the dead. "Rebecca tells me you've been keeping watch here since 1949. That's a long time to stand guard." "Someone has to," Eliza said, defensive again, pulling her tattered form tighter. "People come here to die. I stop them." "You do," Ezekiel agreed. "And that's holy work, make no mistake. But child, you've earned your rest. You've earned the right to lay down your burden and move on." The words should have felt like release. Instead, they felt like abandonment. "If I leave, who'll watch the ridge? Who'll push back the next James Holloway, the next desperate soul who thinks death is the answer?" Ezekiel's smile held sadness and pride in equal measure. "The living, Miss Thornton. The living will watch." Rebecca here has already started a foundation, suicide prevention outreach specifically for this ridge, hotline numbers posted, regular patrols, counselors trained for crisis intervention. The work you started will continue. Rebecca nodded, her eyes bright. "You showed us the need, Eliza. You proved it was possible to catch people before they fall. Now let us honor your legacy by taking over the watch. Let yourself finally rest." But rest felt wrong, felt like quitting, felt like admitting that she'd wasted 73 years on a mission that humans could have handled all along. Eliza drifted backward, her form flickering with distress. "I can't. This is all I have. Without the ridge, without the saving, I'm just a woman who jumped, just another suicide, just pathetic Eliza who couldn't handle a little heartbreak." "No," Ezekiel said, his voice hardening with something between anger and compassion. "You're a woman who transmuted her pain into purpose, who took the worst moment of your life and used it to prevent the worst moments of others' lives. You're not pathetic. You're a guardian angel. And child, even angels are allowed to go home." The fog swirled around them, responding to Eliza's emotional turbulence, and for a moment she felt the pull again. That warm light she'd rejected in 1949, still waiting, still patient, still promising peace she'd denied herself for 7 decades. But between her and that light stood a question she'd never been able to answer. Did she deserve it? Had she done enough? Was 73 years of penance sufficient payment for one moment of weakness? Rebecca stepped forward, closing the distance between living and dead. "Eliza, listen to me. You didn't fail yourself in 1949. Frank failed you. The people who should have seen your pain and helped you, they failed you. Mental health care in the 1940s failed you. You were sick and you needed help, and instead of getting it, you got judgment and isolation. Your death wasn't weakness, it was tragedy. And what you've done since, that's been beautiful and selfless and heroic. But honey, it's okay to stop now. It's okay to forgive yourself and move on." Forgive herself. The words hung in the October air, and Eliza felt the foundations of her haunting crack wider. What would that look like? Forgiveness. What would it mean to accept that she'd been sick rather than weak, that she'd deserved help rather than condemnation, that her death had been a failure of systems rather than character? The light pulsed brighter, responding to her wavering resolve, and Eliza saw something she'd missed 73 years ago. Her mother waited there, yes, and her baby brother. But Frank didn't. Whatever happened to bastards who broke their wives' hearts and drove them to suicide? It wasn't the same warm light that called to her. Justice existed, even in death. She wouldn't have to face him, wouldn't have to endure his presence in eternity. She'd be free of him in ways she'd never been free while alive. "What about the next person?" Eliza whispered, and Ezekiel smiled. "We'll catch them, I promise you, on my faith and my calling. We'll catch them. Your work will continue, just in different hands. Eliza looked at Rebecca, at this young woman who'd driven up a mountain because she cared about a ghost she'd never met. At Pastor Crawford, who dedicated his retirement to helping spirits find peace. At the phone full of faces, lives saved, generations born from her 7 decades of vigil. Maybe it was enough. Maybe she'd earned the rest she'd denied herself. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something you achieved, but something you chose consciously and deliberately, despite all the voices that said you didn't deserve it. I don't know how to let go, Eliza admitted, and Rebecca smiled through her tears. Then let us help you. That's what you've been doing for 73 years, right? Helping people through the hardest transition they'll ever face. Let us return the favor. They held a ceremony at the ridge 3 nights later, when the moon was full, and the veil between worlds wore thin as gossamer. Rebecca brought candles that wouldn't light in the wind, so Ezekiel improvised with LED votives, their steady glow a concession to modernity Eliza found oddly comforting. More people came than she'd expected. James Holloway drove up from Knoxville with Sarah, now a teenager, who'd painted her nails black and wore a vintage 1940s dress in Eliza's honor. Marcus Washington's granddaughter represented him, carrying a photo of a man who'd lived to 93, thanks to a ghost he'd glimpsed only once. Others came too, children and grandchildren of the 47, some who knew the story, and some who were just learning that their existence hinged on a suicide that hadn't been. They formed a circle on the ridge where Eliza had fallen, where she'd spent 73 years catching others before they could make the same choice. Rebecca had mapped it all out, explained to Eliza that the ceremony would help her let go, that the combined intention of the living could strengthen her enough to make the crossing she'd denied herself. Eliza drifted through the gathering, watching faces that existed because she'd stayed. A young man who looked so much like that desperate stranger from 1952, she had to look twice. A woman in her 60s who'd driven from Memphis, her mother saved in 1981. Her entire family branch a gift from Eliza's vigil. Children running around the edges of the circle, their laughter proof that death could be defied, that despair wasn't final, that sometimes ghosts were angels in disguise. Ezekiel began the ceremony with a prayer that acknowledged both Christian theology and something older, the mountain magic that had sustained Eliza when doctrine would have demanded she move on. He spoke of guardian spirits and the thin places where the dead could touch the living. He spoke of purpose transforming pain, of love stronger than death, of 73 years spent in service to strangers who became statistics, who became legacy. Then each person in the circle spoke a name, 47 names, the people Eliza had saved, rolling out like a benediction. Marcus Washington, Jennifer Chen, Thomas Reeves, Patricia Delgado, James Holloway. When they reached 47, Sarah Holloway stepped forward. She was 15 and alive and looking at Eliza with eyes that saw her clearly, the way Rebecca did. Rebecca had done something, prepared her somehow, lifted the veil enough that the teenager could perceive the ghost who'd saved her father. "I didn't get to thank you," Sarah said, her voice wavering. "I was 8 and sick and didn't understand why Dad came home crying that night. But I'm 15 now, and I understand. You gave me my father. You gave me my life. So thank you, Eliza. Thank you for staying long enough to catch him." Eliza felt her form destabilizing, the emotion too large to contain in her ghostly architecture. She'd saved Sarah without knowing Sarah existed, had pushed James back without understanding the full mathematics of salvation. And now this child, this living, breathing proof that her death hadn't been meaningless, stood before her with gratitude glowing like starlight. "You're welcome," Eliza whispered, and meant it with every particle of her dissipating existence. Rebecca raised her hands and the circle fell silent. "Eliza May Thornton, you've stood watch for 73 years. You've saved 47 lives and countless more by extension. You've earned your peace. We release you from your vigil. We take up the watch. We promise to honor your legacy by catching the ones who come after. You can rest now. You can go home." The light appeared then, not gradually but all at once, a warmth that made the October night feel like summer noon. Eliza saw her mother inside it, younger than Eliza remembered, smiling with a pride that erased 7 decades of guilt. Her baby brother stood beside her, grown now in whatever way the dead grew, his hand extended toward his sister who'd spent so long in self-imposed exile. But before Eliza could move toward them, she felt something else. A pull from the ridge itself, from the fog and the stone and the 7 decades of intention she'd poured into this place. The territory she'd claimed was claiming her back, offering an alternative she hadn't considered. She could go into the light, yes, could finally accept the peace she'd denied herself, or she could stay but differently. Not as punishment, not as penance, but as true guardian. Not trapped by guilt, but anchored by choice. Free to leave whenever she wanted, but choosing to remain because the work mattered and she was good at it. Rebecca felt the hesitation and understood. You don't have to go if you're not ready. But Eliza, if you stay, it needs to be because you want to, not because you think you have to. It needs to be choice, not obligation. Eliza looked at the light, at her mother's welcoming arms. Then she looked at the ridge, at the fog rolling in like it did every October, at the faces of the living who'd promised to continue her work. She thought about James Holloway and the 46 others, about the ripples spreading out from each salvation, about the mathematics of meaning in a universe that often seemed devoid of it. The light was beautiful. Peace was tempting. But the ridge was hers, and the work was holy, and she'd spent 73 years learning to touch the living world through sheer force of desperate will. Why would she abandon that now, when she finally understood it wasn't punishment, but calling? I'm staying, Eliza said, and felt the guilt that had anchored her dissolve like fog in sunlight. Not because I have to, because I choose to, because this is my ridge, and these are my people, and I'm good at catching the ones who fall. Her mother's smile in the light held understanding. The warmth didn't dissipate but shifted, surrounding Eliza rather than calling her. She felt it soak into her ghostly form, changing something fundamental in her architecture. The chains of guilt snapped. The weight of penance lifted. What remained was pure purpose, freely chosen, anchored by love rather than shame. When the light faded, Eliza stood different, stronger, more solid. Her dress no longer hung in tatters, but restored itself, the blue cotton she'd worn on her wedding day now pristine and whole. Her eyes still held depths, but they reflected stars instead of sorrow. She was still dead, still a ghost, but no longer haunted by her own death. Thank you, she said to the circle, to Rebecca and Ezekiel and Sarah, and all the descendants of the 47. Thank you for showing me the difference between earning forgiveness and accepting it. Rebecca wiped her eyes, laughing through tears. So you're really staying? I'm really staying, but I want you to know, when I'm ready to go, I will. This isn't forever, just for now, for as long as the ridge needs watching and I want to watch it. The ceremony ended with cake, because Sarah had insisted that even ghost funerals needed cake, and the circle dissolved into conversation and laughter that felt strange and beautiful on a ridge usually reserved for despair. Eliza drifted among them, accepting thanks and giving blessings, finally allowing herself to feel pride in the work she'd done. As midnight approached and the living began filtering down the trail to their cars, James Holloway hung back. He approached Eliza slowly, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression carrying the weight of 7 years of wondering. I never thanked you properly, he said. That night, I was ready to jump. I had it all planned out, and you stopped me. How's Sarah? Eliza asked, and James's face transformed with joy so pure it made her remember what it felt like to be alive. She's perfect, healthy, smart as hell and twice as stubborn. We're close now, in a way we might not have been if I'd survived, but stayed broken. You didn't just save my life. You gave me a reason to fix it. He pulled something from his pocket, a small stone, polished smooth by mountain streams. I come up here every year on the anniversary. Leave a stone to mark another year I got because you gave it to me. I've got 7 now, planning on 700. He placed the stone at the ridge's edge, and Eliza saw that it wasn't alone. The edge was lined with stones, pebbles and rocks, and polished river glass, 47 different colors for 47 different people. each one a year of gratitude, a memorial to the death that hadn't happened. "I'll keep watch over them," Eliza promised, and James smiled. "I know you will." "But Eliza, don't forget to live a little too. Even ghosts deserve joy." He left her then, walking down the trail with his daughter, and Eliza stood alone on the ridge as the fog rolled in thick and comforting. She could feel the despair approaching before she saw its source, a woman in her 30s, driving up the mountain road with death in her heart and pills in her purse. The 48th. But this time, Eliza didn't approach from a place of guilt or penance. She approached from choice, from purpose, from the understanding that saving others didn't erase her death, but redeemed it in ways Frank Thornton's letter could never diminish. She solidified in the fog before the woman reached the edge, and her voice carried harmonics of 73 years of practice, plus 7 days of transformation. "Not tonight," Eliza said, and the woman stopped, staring at the impossible figure in the pristine blue dress. "Tonight you turn around. Tonight you call someone. Tonight you choose to stay. And if you need help choosing, I'm here. I've been here since 1949, and I'll be here as long as it takes." The woman stared, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. "Are you real? Real enough to push you back if you try to jump? Real enough to sit with you until dawn if that's what you need? Real enough to tell you that depression lies, despair lies, and whatever voice in your head is saying you're worthless is wrong? I know. I listened to that voice once, and I've spent 7 decades proving it false." The woman's face crumpled, and Eliza sat beside her on the cold stone, solid enough to be felt, if not quite solid enough to be warm. They talked through the night, ghost and desperate stranger, until the first light of dawn painted the Tennessee mountains gold, and the woman drove down with a crisis hotline number in her phone, and hope in her heart she hadn't felt in months. 48. The work continued. But this time, Eliza May Thornton watched her drive away with pride instead of guilt, with peace instead of penance, with the understanding that her death had been tragedy, but her afterlife was triumph. She stood watch as the sun rose over Clingman's Ridge, and for the first time in 73 years, she smiled without sorrow. The fog would come again tonight, and the desperate would find their way to the edge. But Eliza would be waiting, choosing every night to stay, to watch, to catch the ones who fell, not as punishment, as purpose. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Because 47 lives saved deserved to become 48, then 49, then hundreds more. Because redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering, but something you chose through service. And because sometimes the best way to save yourself is to save everyone else instead. Not from guilt, from love. The ridge settled into its new normal over the following months. Rebecca's foundation installed permanent fixtures, crisis hotline signs at the parking lot, benches with counseling resources carved into brass plaques, lighting that made the trails safer at night. But the foundation's work complemented Eliza's rather than replacing it. The living could catch some, but Eliza caught the ones who came after dark, who parked in hidden turnouts, who knew all about the signs and the hotlines and came anyway because their despair had calcified beyond the reach of pamphlets and phone numbers. She'd saved 12 more people by Christmas, bringing her total to 59. Each one received the same treatment. Her voice in the fog, her presence solid enough to push or pull, her willingness to sit through the long dark hours until dawn made the world seem survivable again. She learned their names, their stories, the specific shapes their pain had taken. Michael Chen, a surgeon who'd lost a patient and couldn't forgive himself. Aisha Williams, a veteran with PTSD and survivor's guilt eating her alive. Dmitry Volkov, a refugee who'd lost his entire family and didn't know how to build a life in a country that didn't want him. Each one drove down the mountain eventually, carrying her words with them. Depression lies. Despair lies. The voice telling you you're worthless is wrong. Some of them came back months later, the way James did, to leave stones at the ridge's edge. Others sent letters to Rebecca's foundation, asking her to pass along their thanks to the ghost they'd met in the fog. A few never acknowledged it at all, probably convinced they'd hallucinated the whole encounter, but alive nonetheless, and that was what mattered. Eliza kept their stones in a mental collection, a rosary of salvation she'd finger in quiet moments. Rebecca visited twice a month, bringing news from the living world and checking on Eliza's spiritual health with the dedication of a therapist monitoring a recovering patient. "How are you feeling?" she'd ask, and Eliza would answer honestly. Some days peaceful, some days restless, some days still wrestling with whether she'd truly earned the right to exist without suffering. Ezekiel came less frequently, but with more intensity, conducting small ceremonies on solstices and equinoxes, helping Eliza stay anchored to purpose rather than drifting toward either light or darkness. The pattern held through winter into spring. Then, on a March evening when the ridge bloomed with dogwood and mountain laurel, Frank Thornton's granddaughter drove up the mountain. Eliza felt her coming, the bloodline connection registering as a cold familiarity, like recognizing someone's face from a photograph you'd burned decades ago. The young woman was 26, tall and auburn-haired like Frank had been, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she was worthless. She parked at the overlook and walked straight to the edge, but Eliza didn't sense despair. This wasn't a suicide attempt. This was a pilgrimage. "Eliza May Thornton," the woman called into the fog, her voice steady and sure. "I'm Amanda Thornton Pierce, Frank's granddaughter. I came to apologize for what he did to you." The shock of it nearly destabilized Eliza's form entirely. In 74 years of haunting, she'd never expected this. Had never imagined that Frank's descendants would even know her name, much less seek her out, much less feel responsibility for his sins. She materialized slowly, letting Amanda see her in stages. First, just a shimmer in the fog, then a shadow, then fully visible in her pristine blue dress with her eyes that reflected starlight. Amanda didn't flinch. She met Eliza's gaze head-on, and her expression held grief and anger, and a determination that reminded Eliza of herself at 29, before Frank had broken her. "I didn't know about you until last month," Amanda said. "My grandmother finally told me before she died. Told me that Grandpa Frank had a first wife who killed herself because he was a cruel bastard who married her for money and broke her heart. She said it ate at him in his later years, that he died knowing he'd killed you as surely as if he'd pushed you off this ridge himself." Eliza absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the Frank she'd known, charming, manipulative, utterly lacking in empathy, with a man who'd eventually felt guilt. Did it change him? The guilt? Amanda's laugh was bitter. Not enough. He stayed selfish and emotionally abusive until the day he died. But my grandmother said he'd wake up screaming sometimes, having nightmares about you, about your face when you read his letter, about finding out you'd jumped. The vindication felt smaller than Eliza had imagined it would, back when she'd first chosen to stay on the ridge. She'd spent decades wondering if Frank ever thought of her, ever regretted his cruelty. Now she knew he had, and it barely mattered. His nightmares couldn't undo her death. His guilt couldn't erase 74 years of haunting. He'd moved on to whatever afterlife awaited emotional abusers, and she was still here, still doing the work, still choosing every night to stay. "Why did you come?" Eliza asked. "What do you want from me?" Amanda pulled something from her pocket, a small leather journal worn and water-stained. "This is his diary, from the last year of his life when the nightmares were worst. I thought you deserved to read it, to know that he suffered, that he didn't get to forget you and live happy." Eliza stared at the journal, and for a moment she felt the pull of it, the temptation to read Frank's words, to confirm that he'd been haunted by her the way she'd been haunted by him, to know that their marriage had destroyed him too in smaller but real ways. But then she thought about the 48 people she'd saved since letting go of her guilt, thought about Michael and Aisha and Dimitri, and all the others whose names she carried like prayer beads, thought about the work she did every night, the choice she made every morning to stay anchored, not to vengeance, but to purpose. "I don't want it," Eliza said quietly. "What Frank felt or didn't feel, it doesn't matter anymore. I'm not here because of him. I'm here because of them." She gestured to the stones lining the ridge's edge, 48 different colors for 48 different lives, each one proof that her death hadn't been the end of her story. Amanda looked at the stones, then back at Eliza, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're the guardian, the one who saves people from jumping. Jesus, I thought that was an urban legend." "It's not legend if I'm standing right here." Eliza smiled, and it felt genuine in ways smiles hadn't felt in 1949. "But Amanda, I appreciate you coming. I appreciate knowing that Frank's bloodline produced someone who cares about apologies and accountability. That's more than he ever gave me." Amanda hesitated, then asked the question Eliza could see forming behind her eyes. "Do you hate us, his descendants? Do you blame us for what he did?" Eliza considered this carefully. In her early decades of haunting, when the guilt had been sharp and fresh, she might have resented every Thornton who'd benefited from the land Frank had stolen by marrying her. But 74 years of choosing purpose over punishment had taught her that hate was exhausting and bloodlines weren't destiny. "No," Eliza said finally. "You're not responsible for his choices any more than I was responsible for making him love me. He was broken in ways that had nothing to do with either of us. You just had the misfortune of inheriting his name." Relief flooded Amanda's face, and she wiped at tears Eliza hadn't noticed forming. "Thank you, I needed to hear that." She started to leave, then turned back. "What you're doing here, saving people, it's beautiful. I'm sorry you had to die to do it, but it's beautiful nonetheless." After Amanda left, Eliza stood at the ridge and thought about Frank for the first time in years. Really thought about him, not just as the villain in her origin story, but as a complete person with his own damage and demons. He'd been wrong about her worth, catastrophically wrong, and his letter had killed her, as surely as gravity had. But his wrongness didn't define her anymore. She'd transcended it through 74 years of proving that she mattered, that her existence had value, that one moment of weakness didn't negate a lifetime or after-lifetime of strength. The fog rolled in as evening deepened, and Eliza felt the familiar pull of despair approaching. Another desperate soul making their way to the ridge, another life hanging in the balance. 60 would be a nice round number. She smiled and drifted into the mist, ready to catch whoever was falling. Summer brought tourists to the ridge, hikers and photographers who exclaimed over the views, and never knew they walked past a ghost who'd been there longer than their grandparents had been alive. Eliza watched them with bemused detachment, these living people who treated the ridge as scenic destination rather than threshold between life and death. Their presence made her work harder. She had to be more careful about manifesting, more selective about who could see her. But it also reminded her that the ridge could hold both joy and sorrow, that not everyone who came here did so to die. Some came to live, to breathe mountain air and feel small in the face of geological time. The Foundation's work expanded through summer. Rebecca hired 2 full-time counselors who staffed the ridge on weekends, trained to spot the signs of suicidal ideation and intervene before anyone reached the edge. They saved 3 people in June alone, and Eliza felt a fierce pride watching them work. The living catching the living, the way she'd hoped would happen when she'd first chosen to stay. But the counselors went home at sunset, and that's when Eliza's shift began. The truly desperate came at night, when the darkness matched their internal landscape, when witnesses were few and the drop was invisible until too late. She caught 9 more through the summer months, bringing her total to 67, 20 more than her original 47, 20 more futures branching out into possibility because she'd chosen to stay. One of them was a 16-year-old named Tomas Rivera, whose parents had kicked him out for being gay, and who decided dying was easier than surviving their rejection. Eliza sat with him for 6 hours, through the deepest part of night into dawn, telling him about the world she'd watched change over 74 years, about watching attitudes toward people like him shift and evolve, about the fight still ahead, but the progress already won, about the life waiting for him if he'd just hold on long enough to reach it. He drove down at sunrise with the crisis hotline number and Rebecca's foundation card, and a promise to call before trying again. 2 weeks later, Rebecca showed her a photo. Tomas, healthy and smiling, outside a group home for LGBTQ+ youth. "He wanted me to tell you he's applying to college," Rebecca said. "Art school says he's going to paint you someday, the guardian angel of Klingman's Ridge." Eliza felt her form warm with something that might have been what the living called happiness. Another one saved. Another future secured. Another proof that her death hadn't been the tragic waste Frank's letter had implied. August brought Amanda back, this time with her girlfriend and a picnic basket. They spread a blanket at the overlook, far from the edge, and invited Eliza to join them. "We can't eat together, obviously," Amanda said, arranging sandwiches and fruit with careful precision. "But I figured you might want company that isn't suicidal for a change." Eliza materialized on the blanket's edge, amused and touched in equal measure. "You're not afraid of me?" Amanda's girlfriend, Sarah, coincidentally, though not the Sarah Holloway Eliza had saved, laughed. "Baby, you're literally dating the granddaughter of the man whose cruelty created her. If she was going to haunt anyone vindictively, it would be you." "Fair point," Amanda conceded. They talked through the afternoon, and Eliza found herself enjoying it more than she'd expected. Amanda shared stories about dismantling her grandfather's legacy, donating his money to organizations that helped domestic violence survivors. Sarah talked about her work as a therapist specializing in LGBTQ+ youth. "I work with kids like your Tomas all the time," she said, and Eliza loved that she'd called him your Tomas, like Eliza had adopted him through the simple act of saving his life. As the sun set and the living women packed up their picnic, Amanda hesitated. "Would you mind if we came back? Not every week or anything, but sometimes. I know you're busy with your work, but I'd like that," Eliza said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I'd like that very much." After they left, she realized she'd just made friends, real friends, not just people she'd saved or counselors checking on her mental health, but friends who wanted her company for its own sake. 74 years dead, and she was still learning new ways to exist. September brought Pastor Ezekiel with news. "I'm retiring," he said, his kind eyes twinkling. "Really retiring this time. Moving to Florida to be near my grandkids. But I wanted you to know I'm training my replacement specifically to minister to spirits like you. Her name is Maria Santos. She's brilliant, and she'll take good care of you when I'm gone." Eliza felt the loss like a physical thing. Ezekiel had been her spiritual anchor, the one who'd helped her understand that choosing to stay could be holy rather than pathological. But she also understood that the living got to move on, got to retire and be with family and live in Florida if they wanted. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for showing me the difference between penance and purpose." "You showed yourself, child. I just held up the mirror." He conducted one final ceremony at the Ridge, blessing the work she did and the choice she'd made, releasing her from any remaining threads of obligation. "You stay because you want to," he intoned, his voice carrying authority that made the fog itself seem to listen. "You stay because you're called to it, and when that calling ends, you're free to answer a different one. There is no shame in leaving, no shame in staying. Only the holy work of being exactly where you're meant to be." When he left, Eliza stood at the Ridge and felt more free than she'd felt since 1949. Free to go, free to stay, free to change her mind tomorrow or in another 74 years. The freedom itself was the gift, the thing she'd denied herself for decades while trapped in cycles of guilt and penance. Now she chose every morning to stay, and every morning that choice felt lighter, easier, more like blessing than burden. October brought the 74th anniversary of her death, and Rebecca organized something she called a celebration of purpose. Descendants of the 67 people Eliza had saved gathered at the Ridge, bringing stones of every color to add to the memorial at the edge. The line stretched down the trail, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, partners and friends and people whose lives had been changed by someone who'd lived, because Eliza had pushed them back from the drop. They formed a circle, and one by one, they shared stories. Marcus Washington's great-granddaughter talked about the family reunions that wouldn't exist without Eliza. James Holloway brought Sarah, now 16, and planning to study psychology because she wanted to help people the way a ghost had helped her father. Tomas showed up with his portfolio, showing Eliza the paintings he'd created, her in her blue dress, surrounded by fog and light, catching people mid-fall and setting them gently back on solid ground. "You're my guardian angel," he said, his voice steady despite tears. You saved my life, and I'm going to spend my life making art that helps other people like me survive. That's my thank you. That's how I honor what you gave me." At the end, Rebecca asked Eliza to speak. She'd never addressed a crowd before, had spent 74 years as solitary guardian, invisible to all but the desperate and the sensitive. But she materialized fully, letting every person in that circle see her clearly, and she spoke from the center of her ghostly heart. "I died on this ridge 74 years ago because I believed a lie. I believed I was worthless, that the world would be better without me, that my death would be a mercy to everyone involved. I was wrong, catastrophically, tragically wrong, and I spent 7 decades trying to atone for that wrongness by saving everyone else who believed the same lie. But here's what I learned. You can't earn your way out of worthlessness because worthlessness isn't real. It's a story we tell ourselves when we're sick, when we're hurting, when we've been broken by people who should have loved us better. The truth is that every life matters. Every life creates ripples. She gestured to the circle of descendants. You're proof. You exist because I chose to stay, yes, but more importantly, you exist because your ancestors chose to live. Because they listened when I said depression lies. Because they went home and got help and built the families that made you possible. That's the real work. Not my pushing you back from the edge, but your choosing to stay back. You're building lives worth living. You're proving every day that survival is victory." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "I'm staying on this ridge for now, not because I have to, but because I want to. Because the work matters and I'm good at it, and every life I save saves generations. But I want you to know that if I ever choose to leave, I'll do it with joy instead of guilt. And I want you to make the same choice. If you're struggling, if you're hurting, if that voice starts whispering that you're worthless, call someone, text a hotline, drive to an ER. Choose to stay, even if staying feels impossible, because your life creates ripples you can't even imagine. You matter. You've always mattered. And that's not something you earn, it's something you are." The circle erupted in applause and tears, and Eliza felt her form solidify further, fed by the love and gratitude flowing from 67 different bloodlines. She was more real in that moment than she'd been in 74 years of haunting, anchored not by guilt, but by purpose and community and the simple joy of being seen. As the ceremony ended and people filtered down the trail, Amanda approached with something wrapped in cloth. "We made this for you. All of us. The descendants of the 67. We wanted you to have something permanent." She unwrapped it, a bronze plaque, weathered to look old, inscribed with words that made Eliza's ghostly heart catch. Eliza May Thornton, Guardian of the Ridge, 1920-1949, forever. She died so others could live. She stayed so generations could thrive. "We're installing it at the Overlook tomorrow," Amanda said, "so everyone who comes here knows, so you're never forgotten." Eliza couldn't speak, could only watch as Amanda and the others carried the plaque to the Overlook, as they set it in concrete beside the crisis hotline sign, as they created a permanent memorial to a death that had become something more than tragedy. As the last of the living left, Eliza stood before the plaque and traced her name with fingers that couldn't quite touch bronze. 74 years ago she died on this ridge, believing she was nothing. Now she was commemorated in metal, remembered by generations, celebrated for choosing purpose over peace. The fog rolled in as night fell, and Eliza felt the familiar pull. Another desperate soul approaching, another life hanging in the balance. 68 would be nice. She smiled and drifted into the mist, ready for whatever the night would bring. The work continued, but now she did it with joy. The frozen Atlantic spray cut through Samuel Thorne's translucent form as he raised the spectral lantern high above the jagged rocks, its otherworldly blue flame piercing through the November fog that rolled across Pemaquid Point like a living shroud. The fishing trawler pitched violently in the 40-foot swells, its bow smashing against waves that had already claimed 3 men from its deck, their screams swallowed by the howling nor'easter that had appeared without warning on this moonless night in 2019. Samuel could see them, the living crew scrambling across the tilting deck, their movements frantic and desperate as the vessel's hull groaned against the pull of the current, dragging it toward the rocks where he had died 128 years ago. His lantern, the same one he had carried in life as keeper of the Pemaquid light, now burned with the cold fire of the grave, and he swung it in the ancient pattern, 3 long arcs, 2 short, 3 long, the signal he had created in his final moments of life, the warning he had failed to give before the sea took him and 17 souls with him on that October night in 1891. The captain of the trawler, a young man whose terror Samuel could taste like copper on a phantom tongue he no longer possessed, suddenly looked toward the shore, toward the impossible blue light that danced where no living person stood, and something in his salt-stung eyes changed from panic to desperate hope. Samuel knew this moment, had lived it hundreds of times since his death, the instant when the living chose to trust the dead, when the boundary between worlds thinned enough for his warning to matter, and he pushed every ounce of his spectral energy into the lantern until it blazed like a fallen star against the darkness. The trawler's engine roared to life, the captain spinning the wheel hard to starboard, and the vessel lurched away from the rocks with seconds to spare, its keel scraping against the very stones that still held fragments of Samuel's bones, the impact sending a vibration through the spirit realm that made every ghost along the Maine coast pause in their eternal wanderings. As the fishing boat fought its way toward the safety of the harbor, Samuel stood alone on the shore, watching the living disappear into the storm, and felt the familiar weight of his eternal questions settle over him like the fog. How many more must he save before the sea forgave him for the 17 he had failed? If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. Samuel Thorne had not been born for the sea, but he had died for it, and in death he had become something more intimately connected to the Atlantic than any living sailor could comprehend. He existed now in the liminal space between the crash of waves and the silence that follows, a consciousness woven from salt spray and sorrow, from duty unfulfilled and love that transcended the grave. The coast of Maine had changed dramatically since his death, the wooden sailing vessels replaced by diesel engines, the hand-cranked fog bell by automated systems, the kerosene lamps by electric beacons that required no human hand. But the rocks remained eternal, and so did Samuel, bound to them by chains forged from his final failure and tempered by every life he had saved since. He could no longer remember the warmth of sunlight on living skin, or the taste of his wife Catherine's blackberry pie, but he remembered with crystalline clarity the faces of the 17 who had drowned because he had left his post for just 20 minutes to help a neighbor birth a calf. 20 minutes during which the unexpected storm had swept in and dashed the merchant vessel's Starling Hope against the rocks like a child's toy. The guilt had followed him into death, had become the very substance of his ghostly existence, and somewhere in the decades that blurred together like watercolors in rain, Samuel had made his choice. He would walk this shore until he had saved 17 souls, one for each he had failed, and perhaps then the light that still burned in his lantern would finally guide him home to whatever lay beyond this endless vigil. The morning after he saved the fishing trawler broke cold and clear across Pemaquid Point, the kind of crystalline November day that turned the Atlantic into a sheet of hammered silver and made tourists from Boston drive 3 hours just to photograph the lighthouse that had stood sentinel since 1835. Samuel watched them from the rocks, these living people with their bright jackets and their laughter that sounded like music from a world he could no longer touch, and he counted, as he always counted, the lives he had saved. 43 years as keeper before his death, and 128 years of walking this shore afterward, and in all that time, he had pulled 16 souls from the grip of the sea, 16 warnings heeded, 16 vessels turned away from destruction, 16 strangers who went home to families that would never know how close death had come. One more, he told himself, as he had told himself for decades, just one more, and perhaps he could rest. But the sea was cruel in its mercy, sending fewer ships into danger as technology advanced, as GPS and weather satellites and Coast Guard helicopters made his vigil increasingly obsolete, and Samuel sometimes wondered if he was condemned to walk this shore, not for the 17 he had failed, but for eternity itself. a punishment that had no end, because the modern world no longer needed the warnings of the dead. The girl appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, when the tourist season had ended, and the locals had reclaimed the coast for their solitary walks and quiet contemplations. She was small, perhaps 9 years old, with straight black hair that whipped across her face in the constant wind, and she wore a red jacket that seemed too thin for the approaching winter. Samuel noticed her because she was alone, wandering among the rocks with the fearless curiosity of children who have not yet learned that the world can break them, and because she stopped directly in front of him, her dark eyes widening as if she could see him standing there with his lantern in the full light of day. Most of the living looked through him, their eyes sliding past his spectral form as if he were merely another shadow cast by the lighthouse. But this child, Emma, he would later learn her name was Emma Chen, stared directly at him with an expression of wonder rather than fear, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and bright as a bell cutting through fog. "Are you the ghost my grandmother told me about?" Emma asked, tilting her head to one side in a gesture that reminded Samuel painfully of his own daughter, dead now for 90 years, but forever 6 years old in his memory. "She said there's a man who walks the shore with a blue light, and he saves people from the rocks. She said her grandfather saw you once in 1957 when his lobster boat almost wrecked." The child took a step closer, seemingly unafraid of the translucent figure before her, of the way the light passed through Samuel's form and cast strange double shadows on the stones. "I can see you. Does that mean I'm going to drown?" Samuel felt something shift in the fabric of his existence, a tremor in the usually solid state of his eternal present. In 128 years of haunting this coast, only a handful of living souls had perceived him clearly, usually sailors in mortal danger, their proximity to death thinning the veil between worlds. But this child stood before him in perfect health and safety, seeing him as clearly as if he still drew breath. He tried to speak, to reassure her, but his voice came out as the sound of wind through hollow spaces, the creak of old wood, the distant tolling of a bell that no longer existed. Emma frowned, concentrating, and Samuel realized with shock that she was trying to understand him, that somehow this impossible child could not only see him, but could almost hear him across the barrier of death. "I'm not afraid of ghosts," Emma said matter-of-factly, settling herself on a rock as if preparing for a long conversation. "My grandmother says the dead are just people who loved something so much they couldn't leave it behind." "What did you love?" She paused, watching Samuel with those unnervingly perceptive eyes, and then added, "Was it the lighthouse or was it the people you tried to save?" The question struck Samuel with the force of a nor'easter, because in all his years of walking this shore, counting his saved souls and waiting for redemption, he had never stopped to consider that perhaps his vigil was not about duty or guilt, but about the simple, stubborn love that had defined his living years. Love of the sea, love of the keeper's calling, love of the strangers whose lives depended on the light he tended. The lantern in his hand flared brighter, its blue flame dancing wildly, and Emma smiled as if he had answered her question. A man's voice called from the direction of the parking lot, sharp with parental concern. "Emma! Emma Chen, you get away from those rocks right now!" The girl stood reluctantly, brushing dried seaweed from her jeans, but before she left, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object that she placed carefully on the rock where she had been sitting. It was a smooth piece of sea glass, worn by decades of wave action, into a perfect oval of deep blue that caught the afternoon light like a gem. "For your collection," Emma said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to leave gifts for ghosts. "I'll come back tomorrow. You can tell me your story then." She ran off toward her father, a tall man with graying hair who swept her into his arms, with the relieved fierceness of someone who knew how quickly children could be lost to the sea, and Samuel stood alone among the rocks, staring at the piece of sea glass that glowed with the exact shade of blue as the flame in his eternal lantern. That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Samuel did not walk his usual patrol of the shore. Instead, he stood at the edge of the water, where the waves broke against the rocks in their endless rhythm, and he thought about the girl who could see him, about her question that had cut through a century of habit and forced him to remember why he had first taken up the keeper's lantern. He had been 22 years old, newly married to Catherine Thorne née Blackwell, when the lighthouse service had posted him to Pemaquid Point, and he had approached the position with the solemn dedication of a man who understood that lives depended on his vigilance. Every evening at sunset, he had climbed the spiral stairs to light the lamp, had polished the Fresnel lens until it shone like a star, had maintained the logbook with entries that tracked not just weather and ships, but his own growing love for this isolated stretch of coast where the land met the sea in a violent marriage of stone and water. Catherine had hated it at first, the loneliness and the constant wind and the way the lighthouse demanded Samuel's attention like a jealous lover. But she had come to understand what he had known from the first night he lit the lamp, that this was not just a job but a sacred trust, that somewhere out on that dark water sailors depended on the light he tended, and to fail them would be to fail at the most fundamental duty of human kindness. The memory of his living years felt both distant and immediate, as if they had happened to someone else, yet remained the core of who he was, even in death. Samuel remembered his daughter Charlotte, born 3 years after they arrived at Pemaquid, how she had learned to walk on these same rocks and had called the lighthouse Papa's Tower. He remembered the other keepers' families scattered along the Maine coast, the community of souls who understood the isolation and the importance of their work, who gathered for rare celebrations and supported each other through the long winters when the ice formed so thick around the point that supplies couldn't get through. He remembered the ships he had guided safely past the rocks, the schooners and brigs and later the steam vessels that marked the changing times, and he remembered the terrible night in October 1891 when he had made his fatal choice. His neighbor Jacob Winters had come running to the lighthouse in a panic, his wife in difficult labor with their 4th child, the midwife delayed by a fallen tree across the road, and Jacob had begged Samuel to come help, to use his strength to assist with the birth while Catherine tended to the lamp. 20 minutes, Jacob had promised. The baby was already crowning, just 20 minutes to save a life, and Samuel had made the choice that had haunted him ever since. He had left his post. The storm had come from nowhere, a freak squall that the later investigation would call an act of God, rolling in from the northeast with winds that went from 15 knots to 70 in a matter of minutes. Catherine had been in the kitchen heating water for supper when it hit, had not seen the darkness descending or heard the wind rise over the sound of the wood stove, and by the time she realized what was happening and ran to light the lamp, the merchant vessel Starling Hope was already among the rocks. Samuel had heard the screams from Jacob's house half a mile inland, had torn himself away from the newborn baby girl he had just helped deliver, and run toward the lighthouse with his heart hammering in his chest and the certain knowledge that he had failed. He had arrived in time to see the ship breaking apart, to see the 17 souls. He would later learn all their names, would memorize them like a litany of sin, clinging to debris and drowning in the freezing October water, and he had waded in with a rope tied around his waist, had managed to pull 2 men from the surf before a wave swept him into the rocks and shattered his skull. His last conscious thought as he died had been of Catherine's face in the lamplight, of Charlotte sleeping in her small bed, of the light that should have been burning but was not. And then there had been darkness and cold, and the terrible moment of awakening to find himself still on the shore, but no longer among the living. The first years of his death had been confused and terrifying, a blur of half-formed consciousness and desperate attempts to communicate with the living who looked through him as if he were wind. Samuel had tried to touch Catherine, to tell her that he did not blame her for his death, but his hands passed through her like smoke and his voice made no sound that mortal ears could hear. He had watched her pack up their belongings and leave the lighthouse with Charlotte in her arms, had seen a new keeper arrive to take his place, and he had understood with crushing finality that he was bound to this shore, that some part of him had refused to leave when death came calling. The lantern had appeared in his hands on the 1-year anniversary of his death, manifesting from the same spectral realm that gave him form, and with it had come an instinctive understanding of his purpose. He could still tend the light, could still warn ships away from the rocks, could still fulfill the duty he had failed in his final living moments. The first time he saved a life, a fishing dory caught in heavy fog in 1893, its crew of 3 following the blue glow of his lantern to safety, Samuel had felt a surge of hope that perhaps this was his path to redemption, that perhaps if he saved enough souls, he could undo the damage of his one fatal mistake. But the mathematics of salvation proved more complicated than simple addition. 17 lives lost demanded 17 lives saved, or so Samuel had reasoned in those early years, and he had thrown himself into his eternal vigil with the dedication he had once brought to his living duties. Yet as the decades passed and the count rose, 5 saved by 1910, 8 by 1925, 12 by 1947, Samuel began to realize that redemption was not a transaction, but a transformation, that he was not counting toward freedom, but rather learning what it meant to love this shore and its people, with a love that transcended the need for forgiveness. The ships changed from wood to steel, from sail to engine, from manual navigation to GPS, and Samuel changed with them, learning to recognize the electronic signatures of distress, to sense when a vessel was in danger even before its crew knew, to manifest his light in ways that modern equipment could detect. He became part of the coast's living folklore, the ghost whose blue lantern appeared to sailors in trouble, whose warnings had saved 16 lives across 128 years, whose presence was dismissed by skeptics and sworn to by those who had seen him in their moment of need. The second time Emma Chen came to the rocks, she brought a thermos of hot chocolate and a book about Maine lighthouses. Her father, Robert Fitzgerald, watched from a distance, leaning against the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of the lighthouse property, his expression a mixture of concern and bemused acceptance. Samuel later learned that Robert was a widower, that Emma's mother, Robert's Chinese-American wife Jennifer, had died of cancer 2 years ago, and that the move to Maine from Boston was meant to be a fresh start, a chance for father and daughter to heal in a place where the past didn't loom around every corner. Emma settled herself on the same rock as before, the piece of sea glass she had left now incorporated into a small cairn of stones that Samuel had built during the night, and she opened her book to a page marked with a ribbon. It says here that Samuel Thorne was the keeper of Pemaquid Light from 1868 to 1891, Emma read aloud, her finger tracing the words. It says he died trying to save passengers from the wreck of the Starling Hope, and that his wife Catherine never forgave herself for not lighting the lamp that night. She looked up at Samuel with those dark, knowing eyes. That's you, isn't it? You're Samuel Thorne. It was not a question, and Samuel found himself nodding, the gesture coming naturally despite the strangeness of being recognized after so many years of anonymity. And you're still here because you think it was your fault, because you left to help someone and the ship wrecked and you died, and now you think you have to save people forever to make up for it. Emma closed the book and hugged it to her chest. That's really sad. My mom used to say that we're not responsible for things we can't control, that we can only do our best and love people while we can. She said that right before she died, when I was crying because I couldn't make her cancer go away. She told me I was enough, just being there with her. Maybe you were enough too. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, shaking the foundation of the story he had told himself for more than a century. What if his vigil was not about redemption, but about refusal? Refusal to forgive himself, refusal to accept that good people can make difficult choices and still fail, refusal to believe that love and effort might be enough even when they cannot prevent tragedy. The lantern in his hand flickered, its blue flame dimming for just a moment, and in that darkness Samuel saw clearly for the first time since his death. He saw the baby girl he had helped deliver that night, Sarah Winters, who had grown up to become a teacher and a mother of 5, whose existence was a direct result of his choice to leave his post. He saw Catherine's long life after his death, remarried to a kind man who had raised Charlotte as his own, the happiness they had found despite the grief. He saw the 16 souls he had saved over the decades, their lives branching out into marriages and children and grandchildren, into contributions to their communities and kindnesses shown to strangers, into the immeasurable ripple effect of a life preserved. And he saw the 17 who had died, but he saw them differently now, not as failures he must atone for, but as tragedies he shared, as people whose deaths were the result of a storm's random cruelty and not his personal insufficiency. Emma was watching him with an expression of careful hope, as if she could sense the shift happening in the spectral space where Samuel existed. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn from handling. "This is my mom," she said, holding up the image of a beautiful woman with Emma's dark eyes and a smile that radiated warmth. She believed in ghosts. She used to tell me that the people we love never really leave us, that they stay as long as we need them, even if we can't see them. I think maybe you've been staying for the wrong reasons, Mr. Thorne. I think maybe you've been so busy trying to make up for one bad night that you forgot you had 43 good years here, and 128 more years of helping people after that. She set the photograph down next to the cairn of stones. My mom also said that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is forgive ourselves. Maybe it's time you tried that. Over the following weeks, Emma became a regular visitor to the shore, appearing after school with her backpack and her endless questions, and Samuel found himself experiencing something he had not felt since death, the simple pleasure of companionship. Through a combination of her intuitive perception and his growing ability to manipulate sound and light, they developed a language of sorts, Samuel using the flame of his lantern to flicker yes or no, arranging stones to spell out simple messages, creating patterns in the sand that Emma would decipher, with the seriousness of an archaeologist. She told him about her life, her father's work as a marine biologist at the Darling Marine Center, her struggle to make friends at her new school, her memories of her mother that grew both more precious and more distant with each passing day. In turn, Samuel showed her the coast as only a ghost could see it, revealing the hidden pools where seals gave birth, the rocks where smugglers had once hidden contraband during Prohibition, the exact spot where he had taken his last living breath. Emma proved to be a natural historian, filling a notebook with sketches and observations, and Samuel realized with bittersweet clarity that she was giving him the gift his own daughter never had the chance to give, the chance to teach, to share his knowledge and love of this place with someone who truly cared to learn. It was Emma who noticed the changes first, the subtle signs that something was wrong with the lighthouse itself. The modern beacon had been automated for decades, maintained by a rotating series of Coast Guard personnel who checked the systems monthly and otherwise left the structure to weather and time. But in early December, Emma pointed out that the light seemed dimmer than usual, that it was flickering at irregular intervals, that something in the automated system was failing. Samuel, who had spent his entire afterlife focused on the rocks and the water and the ships that might founder there, had not paid attention to the lighthouse's mechanical systems in years, had not realized that the technology that had replaced his living hands was itself growing old and unreliable. That night, he climbed the spiral stairs for the first time since his death, his spectral form passing through the locked door at the base of the tower, and what he found in the lamp room filled him with cold dread. The main beacon was indeed failing, its bulb flickering and dimming as wiring degraded by salt air, and time struggled to provide steady power, and the backup systems, the fail-safes that should have automatically engaged, showed the telltale signs of corrosion and neglect. A storm was forecast for the end of the week, a major nor'easter that would bring high winds and dangerous seas, and the lighthouse that had guided ships safely past Pemaquid Point for nearly 2 centuries was on the verge of going dark. Samuel tried everything within his spectral power to fix the systems, but his insubstantial hands could not grip wires or replace bulbs, could not turn screws or reset circuit breakers. Frustrated and desperate, he manifested his presence so strongly that the temperature in the lamp room dropped to near freezing, and the air shimmered with the blue glow of his lantern, but the physical world remained stubbornly beyond his reach. It was Emma who suggested they needed help, who insisted that her father could contact the Coast Guard, but Samuel knew from long experience that bureaucratic systems moved slowly and that the coming storm would not wait for official channels. What they needed was someone who understood both the modern technology and the ancient importance of the keeper's duty, someone who could bridge the gap between past and present, and in that moment of desperate clarity, Samuel remembered Dylan Torres. Dylan was 28 years old, a Coast Guard technician who had been assigned to maintain the automated lighthouse systems along the central Maine coast for the past 3 years. Samuel had watched him work from a distance, had noted the care and respect Dylan brought to his duties, the way he spoke to the lighthouse as if it were a living thing deserving of honor. Unlike most modern technicians who viewed the old structures as obsolete monuments, Dylan understood that they were still essential backups to GPS and electronic navigation, that in the worst storms when power failed and satellites lost signal, The physical presence of a light on the shore could mean the difference between life and death. He was also, Samuel had noticed, unusually sensitive to the presence of the dead. Not as gifted as Emma, but possessed of that edge of perception awareness that made him pause sometimes in his work and look around, as if sensing something just beyond the veil of the visible world. Emma took charge of the plan, with the confidence of a child who had not yet learned that most adults would dismiss talk of ghosts as imagination. She convinced her father to invite Dylan to dinner, casually mentioning during the meal that she had noticed the lighthouse beacon seemed dimmer than usual, planting the seed of concern that would draw the technician to investigate. Robert Fitzgerald, who had slowly come to accept that his daughter's relationship with the lighthouse ghost was, if not entirely real, at least therapeutically beneficial in her grief, played along with a mixture of amusement and genuine worry. Dylan, ever conscientious, promised to check the systems the next day, and Emma shot Samuel a triumphant look where he stood invisible in the corner of their small rental house, his presence detectable only as a slight chill in the air and the faint smell of sea salt that seemed to follow him everywhere. The following afternoon, Dylan arrived at the lighthouse with his equipment bag and a handheld diagnostic computer, and Samuel followed him up the spiral stairs, his spectral presence unnoticed but near. The technician's expression grew increasingly grim as he examined the beacon system, as he discovered the extent of the degradation that had gone unnoticed during routine checks. "Jesus," Dylan muttered, pulling out his phone to call his supervisor. "This should have been replaced months ago. The whole wiring harness is shot, and the backup battery system is dead if we get a power outage." He trailed off, but Samuel knew the end of that sentence. If they got a power outage, the lighthouse would go dark, and any ship caught in the storm would have no warning of the rocks. Dylan spent the next hour on the phone, his voice rising in frustration as he argued with distant bureaucrats about emergency repairs and expedited shipments. But the answer was always the same. The replacement parts were on order, but wouldn't arrive until after the holidays. Budget constraints meant overtime wasn't approved, and the forecast storm, while significant, wasn't officially classified as severe enough to warrant emergency protocols. Samuel watched the young man's shoulders slump in defeat, watched him sit on the floor of the lamproom, with his back against the wall and his head in his hands, and he recognized the expression on Dylan's face because he had worn it himself on that terrible October night in 1891. The look of someone who knows their duty but cannot fulfill it, who sees disaster approaching and has no power to prevent it. The ghost moved closer, drawing on every ounce of his spectral energy, and for the first time in 128 years, he tried not just to manifest light or sound, but to speak, to push words across the boundary of death with the same force of will that allowed him to swing his lantern as a warning to ships. The temperature in the lamproom plummeted, frost forming on the windows in spiraling patterns, and Dylan's breath came out in visible puffs as Samuel gathered the cold and the darkness, and his own desperate need to communicate into something approaching a voice. "Tend. The light." The words came out as a whisper of wind, as the creak of old wood and metal, but they were words nonetheless, and Dylan heard them. The technician's head snapped up, his eyes wide, and he scrambled to his feet, his hand reaching instinctively for the flashlight on his belt. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly, and then, more quietly, "Who's there?" Samuel manifested his lantern, letting its blue flame burn bright in the center of the lamproom, and Dylan's flashlight fell from his nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. The young man stared at the impossible sight before him, the translucent figure of a man in 19th-century keeper's clothing, holding a lantern that burned with cold fire, and his face went through a rapid succession of emotions: terror, disbelief, wonder, and finally, incredibly, recognition. "You're the ghost," Dylan whispered, his voice full of awe rather than fear. "The keeper who died in the wreck. I've heard the stories, but I thought—" He laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I thought they were just stories." Samuel nodded, the gesture feeling more natural now that he had a witness who could truly see him, and he pointed to the failing beacon system with his free hand, then to his lantern, then back to the beacon, trying to communicate the urgency of the situation. Dylan seemed to understand, his expression shifting from shock to determination. You want me to fix it. You want me to make sure the light keeps burning." Another nod from Samuel, more emphatic this time, and Dylan took a deep breath, visibly steadying himself. Okay. I don't know how I'm going to explain this to my supervisor, and I'm probably going to get fired for unauthorized repairs, but—" He looked directly at Samuel, and in his eyes, the ghost saw the same dedication that had driven his own living service. A keeper doesn't abandon his post, not for paperwork, not for budget constraints, not for anything. If you could stay here for 128 years to keep people safe, I can risk a job to do the same. What followed was a collaboration that defied both the laws of physics and the regulations of the Coast Guard. Dylan worked through the night, bypassing broken systems and jury-rigging connections with whatever materials he could scavenge from the lighthouse's storage areas, and Samuel helped in ways that should have been impossible, his spectral presence somehow stabilizing flickering circuits, his cold energy condensing moisture that Dylan could use to clean corroded contacts, his intimate knowledge of the lighthouse's original construction guiding the technician to find old backup systems that had been forgotten by generations of modernization. Emma arrived just after dawn with thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches, and she perched on the stairs leading to the lamp room, serving as messenger and moral support, while her father waited anxiously below, still not quite willing to believe in ghosts, but unable to deny that something extraordinary was happening in his daughter's life. By the time the sun fully rose on that December morning, the lighthouse beacon burned steady and bright, powered by a combination of official systems and Dylan's improvised repairs and something else, something that none of them could quite explain, a sense that the building itself had awakened, that the spirit of service that Samuel had embodied in life had somehow infused the very stones and metal of the structure. Dylan sat on the gallery outside the lamp room, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, and Samuel stood beside him, looking out at the Atlantic that had claimed his life and given him his purpose. "The storm hits tonight," Dylan said quietly. "If this holds, we should be okay. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake. The nor'easter arrived at dusk, sweeping in from the northeast with winds that howled like tortured souls, and waves that crashed against Pemaquid Point with enough force to shake the ground. Samuel took his position on the rocks, his lantern burning bright against the darkness, and for the first time in his long vigil, he was not alone. Dylan stood watch in the lamp room, monitoring the systems and making adjustments as needed, while Emma and Robert waited in their house with the lights on and the radio tuned to the weather station, ready to call for help if needed. The storm raged through the night, testing every repair, every connection, every ounce of will that held the lighthouse beacon burning, and 3 times Samuel saw vessels in distress, their running lights barely visible through the horizontal rain and spray. The first was a commercial fishing boat, its engine failing as it struggled against the wind, and Samuel swung his lantern in the old pattern, 3 long, 2 short, 3 long, while Dylan adjusted the main beacon to maximum power, the combined light cutting through the storm to guide the vessel to the safety of the harbor. The second was a yacht that had ignored storm warnings, its crew of weekend sailors completely unprepared for the fury of the Atlantic, and again the lights, both spectral and electric, marked the path to survival. The third came just before dawn, when the storm was at its worst and a Coast Guard cutter fighting its way back to port found itself dangerously close to the rocks, its instruments confused by the electromagnetic chaos of the storm, and it was Samuel's lantern, that impossible blue flame that burned regardless of wind or rain, that gave the captain a visual reference point to navigate by. When the storm finally broke, and the first light of morning turned the ocean from black to grey to silver, Samuel counted 3 vessels saved, bringing his total to 19, 2 more than the 17 who had died in 1891, 2 more than the debt he had thought he needed to repay. He stood on the shore as he had stood for 128 years, but something was different now. Something had shifted in the fundamental nature of his existence. The chains that had bound him to this place, chains forged from guilt and duty and the refusal to forgive himself, felt looser somehow, as if they were becoming translucent like his own form. Emma found him there, picking her way carefully across the rocks, still slick from the storm, and she sat beside him in comfortable silence for a long moment before speaking. "You saved them," she said simply. "All 3 ships made it safely to harbor. My dad heard it on the marine radio." She pulled something from her pocket, another piece of sea glass, this one a rare red, found among the debris washed up by the storm. He also heard the Coast Guard captain talking about a blue light on the rocks, about how his instruments were going crazy, but the light stayed steady and guided them to safety. They're calling it a miracle. She placed the red sea glass in Samuel's translucent hand, and he felt it, actually felt it, the first physical sensation he had experienced since death, smooth and cool and impossibly real. "I think maybe you've done enough, Mr. Thorne. I think maybe you've saved way more than 17 people, if you count all the people who depended on those ships, all the families who would have lost someone if you hadn't been here. I think maybe it's okay to rest now." But Samuel realized, looking at the sea glass in his hand and the girl beside him and the lighthouse standing proud and functional against the morning sky, that he didn't want to rest. Not yet, and maybe not ever. His vigil had begun as penance, but somewhere across the decades, it had transformed into something else entirely. It had become love, pure and simple, love of this coast and its people, love of the duty he had chosen, love of the endless conversation between land and sea that played out on these rocks every day. The 17 who had died were not a debt to be repaid, but a sorrow to be honored. And honoring them meant not abandoning his post, but choosing to stay, choosing to keep the light burning, not because he had to, but because this was where he belonged. The chains that had bound him weren't chains at all, he understood now. They were roots, growing deeper with each passing year, connecting him to this place in ways that transcended guilt or redemption. "I'm not leaving," Samuel said, and this time his voice was clear, heard not just by Emma but by Dylan, who had emerged from the lighthouse, by Robert, who had followed his daughter to the shore, by the spirits of other keepers who walked other coasts along the Maine shoreline. "This is my home. These are my people. I'm not here because I have to be. I'm here because I choose to be." The lantern in his hand flared bright, its blue flame steady and eternal, and Samuel felt the last vestiges of his guilt fall away like chains made of rust and regret. He was not a ghost bound by failure, but a guardian empowered by choice, not a penitent serving a sentence, but a keeper who had found in death the perfect expression of the love that had defined his life. In the months that followed, the lighthouse at Pemaquid Point became something unprecedented in the modern age, a structure where the past and present worked in partnership. Dylan received official approval for his emergency repairs and was assigned as the lighthouse's dedicated maintenance technician, a position that had been eliminated decades ago but was reinstated after 3 separate ships' captains filed reports about the unusual blue light that had saved them during the November storm. Emma became the lighthouse's unofficial historian and Samuel's translator, filling notebooks with stories about the coast's maritime history that she gathered from the ghost who had witnessed it firsthand. Maggie Beaumont, a 71-year-old retired history professor who had spent her career studying Maine's lighthouse service, began regular visits to interview Emma and investigate the phenomenon of a ghost who could communicate clearly with the living, her academic skepticism gradually giving way to wonder as she documented events that defied rational explanation. And Robert, the marine biologist who had brought his daughter to Maine to heal from grief, found himself part of a community that believed in the persistence of love beyond death, that understood loss not as an ending, but as a transformation. Samuel's story spread through the coastal towns of Maine, carried by fishermen and sailors who swore they had seen the blue light on the rocks, by tourists who felt an inexplicable chill and sense of presence when they visited Pemaquid Point, by the families of those saved by the lighthouse's beacon who left offerings of flowers and sea glass at the base of the tower. Some dismissed it as superstition, as the human tendency to create meaning from random events, but those who worked on the water, who understood the terrible power of the sea and the thin margin between life and death that existed there, believed. They believed in Samuel Thorne, the keeper who had died trying to save 17 souls and had stayed to save countless more, who had transformed his failure into a legacy of protection that spanned more than a century. They believed in the blue lantern that burned on the shore, a light that had guided ships safely past the rocks, through calm and storm, through the age of sail and the age of steam, and the age of diesel engines and GPS. They believed in the power of duty fulfilled, not from obligation but from love, in the idea that the best parts of us might persist beyond death if we loved something deeply enough. On a clear night in March, when the winter storms had finally given way to the uncertain promise of spring, Emma and Samuel sat together on their usual rock, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The girl had grown visibly over the past months, her confidence returning as she found her place in her new school and new life, and she had announced at dinner that she wanted to become a marine archaeologist, to study the shipwrecks along the Maine coast and tell the stories of those who had sailed and died on these waters. Samuel knew that this was his gift to her, this sense of purpose born from their friendship, just as her gift to him had been the understanding that redemption was not something to be earned, but something to be accepted, that forgiveness began not with grand gestures, but with the simple decision to see yourself as worthy of grace. "Do you think my mom knows about you?" Emma asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you think she's somewhere out there watching and knowing that I have someone looking out for me?" Samuel considered the question carefully, thinking of his own Catherine, of his daughter Charlotte, of all the people he had loved in life who had long since passed beyond even his spectral sight. He had no certain answers about what lay beyond the veil that separated his haunting from whatever came after, but he had learned something in 128 years of walking between worlds, that love was the only thing that truly persisted, that it was love that had kept him on this shore, and love that connected all the scattered souls across time and space. "I think," Samuel said, his voice the whisper of waves and wind, "that she knows you're loved. That's what matters, not who's doing the loving or where they're doing it from, but that you know you're not alone." Emma nodded, satisfied with that answer, and together they watched the lighthouse beacon sweep across the dark water, a rhythm as old as time, a promise renewed with every rotation, that there would be light in the darkness, that someone was keeping watch, that the sea would not claim every soul it reached for. Years would pass as they always did, bringing changes that Samuel would witness from his eternal post. Emma would grow up and go to college and return to Maine with degrees and discoveries, would write books about the lighthouse service that became standard texts in maritime history courses, would bring her own daughter to sit on the rocks and learn stories from the ghost who had become part of their family. Dylan would eventually become the Coast Guard's leading expert on historic lighthouse preservation, traveling up and down the Atlantic coast, but always returning to Pemaquid Point, always checking in on the beacon that had revealed to him the reality of spirits and service. Maggie would publish a groundbreaking paper on supernatural phenomena and historical memory, using Samuel as her primary case study, and would spend her final years collecting similar stories from other coastal communities, documenting a tradition of guardian ghosts that stretched back to the earliest days of maritime navigation. Robert would remarry, would find love again with a woman who believed in ghosts and second chances, would become a grandfather and introduce his grandchildren to the keeper who watched over their family. The world would change in ways both terrible and wonderful. Technology would advance beyond anything Samuel could have imagined in his living years, but the sea would remain eternal, and so would the need for light to guide those who sailed upon it. And Samuel would remain as well, not trapped but choosing to stay, not counting saved souls but simply being present, ready to swing his lantern when the storms came and the ships found themselves in danger. He was no longer the guilt-haunted keeper who had died trying to undo one tragic mistake, no longer the penitent ghost counting toward an impossible redemption. He was simply Samuel Thorne, who loved this coast and its people, with a love that had proven stronger than death, who had learned that the greatest service was not about earning forgiveness, but about choosing, day after day and year after year, to tend the light that others depended upon. His blue lantern would burn through centuries, a beacon not just for ships, but for anyone who needed to believe that dedication mattered, that duty fulfilled from love rather than obligation could transform failure into legacy, that the people who watched over us, whether living or dead, did so not because they had to, but because they chose to, freely and forever. The Atlantic rolled against the rocks of Pemaquid Point, eternal and indifferent, taking and giving in equal measure, and on the shore stood a figure with a lantern that burned with blue fire, a guardian who had found in death what he had sought in life, the perfect expression of his purpose, the complete fulfillment of his calling. Samuel Thorne, keeper of the light, had come home at last, not to the rest of the grave, but to the endless vigil of the shore, and he would walk here until the sea itself dried up and the stars fell from the sky, because this was not his penance, but his privilege, not his prison, but his paradise. The light would keep burning, the lantern would keep swinging, and somewhere in the darkness those who needed guidance would see that blue flame and know that they were not alone, that someone was watching, that love persisted beyond all reasonable endings into the country of the eternal, where duty and devotion became indistinguishable and the boundaries between life and death blurred into something beautiful and strange and ultimately redemptively kind.